Good morning, everybody. If you saw the mask earlier, you might have put two and two together. I'm not feeling very well this past week. I had a positive COVID test. There's no requirement to isolate from the country anymore, but out of love for you guys and not wanting to share these wonderful germs, if it's all right with you, I'm going to head out after the Q&R. So if you do have questions and you wanted to chat, my email is just tom@hopecityedinburgh.org. 3 easy letters. I didn't put my last name in there because it's impossible to spell. But anyway, there we go. I've made some fill-in notes with some questions that you might want to ponder as you listen to the talk. You can find those on the app. And let's dive in, shall we? Now, last week, David gave us a really helpful look at what could be called one of the major turning points in Matthew's gospel. Maybe it's one of the major turning points in the whole Bible, actually. Peter turns to Jesus and says, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." It's an incredible moment. Now, we, as readers, already know this, right? Because Matthew's been really clear with us about Jesus' divinity. All the way back at the beginning, we've been watching along, seeing angels visiting Mary and Joseph, the events when John baptizes Jesus, and of course the miracles Jesus performs along the way. We as readers are in on the secret, but remember, the disciples are not. So this was the moment where the penny finally dropped for Peter, and he knew that Jesus wasn't just an amazing teacher and miracle worker. He was God in flesh, come to set the world right. Today's passage is a continuation on in that vein. Everything is different now, and Matthew wants us to know this. Last week's passage was a bit like driving your car up a big range of hills. All you can actually see in front of you is more road. It's only when you finally get to the top. That's my favorite place in the world, by the way. Anyone know where that is? It's in Scotland. The Kerrang, yes, on the Isle of Skye. You can just about see the little road that you drive up with no guardrails, trying not to go off the cliff. But this is a bit like you've gone up the road, and then now you can see everything at the top. You've got all this in front of you, and it all makes sense now. If you forgive a slightly nerdy analogy, last week's passage was a bit like the end of The Empire Strikes Back. Some crucial information was revealed that makes all the characters see themselves in a new light, right? We know that it's not the end of the story. It's obviously not the end of the story. In fact, if anything, it's just whetting our appetites to see how it's resolved. And this week's passage, a little bit like Return of the Jedi, shows us how these things will be wrapped up. Remember that up to this point in Matthew's gospel, Jesus has been keeping his cards close to his chest. His disciples are perpetually a bit clueless about who he is and what his plans are, but that's all about to change. Now they know that he is in fact the Messiah, the promised deliverer, God and human. Now let's listen as Rachel reads today's passage for us, and I'm going to go hide over here. I think batteries for you.
It works now. Oh, I'll do this one, Cinderella. Is it on? Great, sorry. We're reading from Matthew chapter 16, verses 21 to 28. And that's on page 983 of the Blue Bibles. And so please do open it and read along with me. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. "Never, Lord," he said, "this shall never happen to you." Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. what good will it be for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? For the Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will reward each person according to what they have done. Truly, I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom.
Rachel. Now, do you see what I meant? Here, Jesus is laying out exactly what's going to happen to him in these last days of his life. And that's not all. We've got an infamous confrontation with Peter and some clues as to what Jesus envisioned the lives of those who followed him would look like, all in one passage. So let's look at them in turn. Our passage this morning starts with Jesus explaining his mission to the disciples in a level of detail that we've not previously seen. There's ultimately 4 things he says he needs to do. First, he needs to go to Jerusalem. You might remember that the bulk of Jesus' life was spent outside Jerusalem, which was the big city and the sort of bustling urban center of the region in this time period. Jesus, however, is born in Bethlehem, not a massive city. He's raised in Nazareth, which is also not a massive place. He spent most of his time in ministry in the towns that surrounded the Sea of Galilee. So the journey to Jerusalem is a big one in terms of travel. It'd be a bit like going from St. Andrews to Edinburgh on foot. Bit of a trek. But what's going to happen when he gets to Jerusalem? It's interesting what he doesn't say. He doesn't say what we might expect, that he's going to go to Jerusalem and heal the sick and feed the hungry. He says he's going to go to Jerusalem and do what? Suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law. This suffering takes all different sorts of forms: ridicule, slander, blasphemy, abandonment, profound legal injustice, and finally, horrific and sustained physical torture. Jesus needs to go, he will suffer, and then he must be killed. He must be killed. I want us to briefly step outside all of our preconceptions for a moment and just acknowledge the sheer audacity on display here. Think about it. Jesus says that he is the promised deliverer, the one Israel's been waiting for. All this language of the kingdom of God coming must have been an amazing moment, an amazing revelation for Jesus' followers, but how can he bring this about if he's dead? And then finally, Jesus says that on the 3rd day he will be raised to life. So a few observations. This is the first of actually 4 times in Matthew's gospel where Jesus will tell his disciples that he's going to die in Jerusalem and be raised back to life. He's given some oblique hints earlier on, but here he's evidently being much more emphatically clear. Now, I've never seen anyone come back from death, but remember that the disciples had. They knew that Jesus had power over life and death in this way, but notice the actual grammar here. Jesus will be raised. The implication here seems to be that this is actually an action of God the Father, perhaps to show that Jesus actually is really and truly dead. Now, we've also got Jesus' response to consider. And remember that we're in one of these major turning points. And in this turning point, Peter has featured majorly. He had been the one that was so bold as to declare in the verses we heard last week that Jesus was this promised Messiah, the deliverer, who was going to bring about the kingdom of God. But look what he does here. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. "Never, Lord," he said. "This shall never happen to you." What do we make of this? Some commentators and preachers are, if I'm honest, a bit mean. Maybe you've heard Christians take shots at Peter, take shots at his brashness, his ignorance, his overzealousness, and this is probably not the most helpful way to approach him. But then again, look at the verse. It starts with Peter taking Jesus aside. He's not voicing this in front of the rest of the disciples, though in reality he's actually probably saying what most of them are thinking. What should we do with Peter? Now, I looked for some help for this, and I ended up looking to John Chrysostom, who was a bishop in the 4th century, and he has a helpful observation. He says this: the larger picture had not yet been revealed to Peter, and he was confused and overwhelmed. Peter had learned that Christ is the Son of God, but he had not learned of the mystery of the cross and the resurrection. Do you see what Chrysostom says there? Peter hasn't yet learned the implications of the cross and the resurrection. He's not seeing Jesus' death as the means by which humanity can be brought into a relationship with God. He's seeing it as an interruption of Jesus' earthly mission. Peter's mind is, if you will, focused on the here and now. And because Peter is focused on the here and now, he's missing the bigger picture. And we could pause at this point. In what ways are we focusing on the here and now? Are we the ones trying to set God's agenda for him? Jesus' response is one of the most misunderstood and sometimes misquoted statements in the Bible, right? Get behind me, Santa. Get behind me, Satan. Is he there? There he is. Seriously though, what do we do with this? It sounds quite harsh. Jesus is a nice guy, right? He's not mean, he's not a jerk. He doesn't tell people off. Well, actually, he kind of does. It gets harsher the more we read. Look what he says in verse 23. Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. Now, how is what Peter said a stumbling block? I think we need to consider this passage actually in light of something that happened earlier in Matthew's gospel. This is a passage that Matt spoke on in January of 2023, and that was a long time ago. So let's have a quick look. The context is that Jesus, before his ministry formally begins, goes out into the wilderness and fasts for 40 days. While he's out there, Satan actively tempts him. So I'll just read from Matthew chapter 4. It says this: Then the devil took him to the holy city and had him stand on the highest point of the temple. If you are the Son of God, he said, throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and they will lift you up in their hands, so that you will not strike your foot against a stone. Jesus answered him, it is also written, do not put the Lord your God to the test. Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world in their splendor. All this I will give you, he said, if you will bow down and worship me. Jesus said to him, away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. Now, did you catch the way Jesus was tempted? Satan was trying to get Jesus to jump from the highest point of the temple so that he could summon angels to rescue him. Then he follows this up by showing Jesus the extent of the visible kingdom in front of him, saying that he could receive all this if he were simply to bow down to him. I think we need to keep in mind that these were real temptations. We might be so inclined towards a view of Jesus that lifts him up and elevates him so much, so other than us, that we don't think he can actually be tempted. But I don't think that's what the Bible's trying to get across to us. For instance, the book of Hebrews tells us that Jesus was tempted in every way, just as we are, and yet he did not sin. So I think we need to read this situation as Peter unintentionally tempting Jesus in the same way that Satan did in the wilderness. Jesus clearly knows that his life will end in a torturous way in the coming days. And when we see him eventually praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, it is clear that the prospect of what he's about to undertake has shaken him to his core. He says that his soul is overwhelmed to the point of death. This is before his arrest. His soul is overwhelmed to the point of death, knowing what awaits him. Tom Wright has a helpful observation on this. He says, Peter, speaking for them all, has just told Jesus that as far as they're concerned, he's not just a prophet. He's God's anointed king, the Messiah. Their natural next move would be to sit down and plan their strategy. If he's the king, and if his people are going to be like the house built on the rock, then they must figure out how to get rid of the present kings and priests who are ruling Israel, or more accurately, misruling it. The obvious solution would be this: march on Jerusalem, pick up supporters on the way, choose your moment, say your prayers, fight a surprise battle, take over the temple and install Jesus as king. That's how the kingdom of God will come. That, we may be sure, was something like what they had in mind. And it's with all this in mind, I think we need to pause and recognize fully that for Peter, Jesus' mission was going to be realized in this political revolution that would change the shape of Palestine in the short term. But what he's missing, and would only find out in the days to come, was that Jesus' mission was actually going to be realized on a spiritual battlefield, in a spiritual revolution that would change the shape of the whole world forever. But given Peter's misunderstanding, Jesus clearly sees the need to spell these things out more fully. And so he outlines the cost of being a disciple. Our passage this morning ends with 3 sets of illustrations from Jesus about what is involved in following Jesus. And they make much more sense if we see them as fundamentally opposed to these ideas that Peter and the disciples had, these sort of political revolutionary ideas. What does it look like? Well, they aren't going to march on Jerusalem on horseback and chase away the Romans. Jesus is going to ride in on the back of a donkey. They aren't going to win over the Jewish leaders to believe that Jesus is the Messiah. Those same leaders will be the ones leading the charge for his execution. They aren't going to watch as Jesus is crowned with a golden crown like his ancestor David, as he assumes the throne that was rightfully his. Instead, they're going to watch helplessly as soldiers use clubs to beat a crown of thorns deeper and deeper into his head. And it's with all this in mind that Jesus first says, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it." Now, this actually isn't the first time Jesus has told his disciples they'll need to pick up their cross and follow him. Back in chapter 10, it's actually sandwiched in a number of initial instructions he gives to the disciples. The American theologian Stanley Hauerwas picks up on this. He says that while the first mention of pick up your cross and follow me leaves some room for ambiguity, this time Jesus makes clear that his reference to the cross, at least with regard to Jesus' listeners at the time, is no metaphor. Jesus plainly says that no one can know what it means for Jesus to be the Messiah unless that one is willing to accompany him to Jerusalem and the fate that awaits him there. Jesus does not ask us to believe in him. Rather, he asks his disciples to follow him, even unto death. So what should we make of this? I think that we can unpack some helpful guiding principles that will keep us from straying into the tall grass. First, remember that crucifixion was a common method of capital punishment in the Roman world, particularly in the colonial frontier. It was a cruel, painful, and shameful public way of striking fear into the local people. It was meant to be a powerful deterrent. This is what happens if you mess with Rome. Given the location and time period, it's entirely plausible that Jesus and his followers had actually walked by crosses bearing living or recently deceased people. Second, remember that Matthew's gospel was written decades after these events happened. By the time of his writing, the church was already being actively persecuted by Jewish and Roman leaders. I suspect that in this verse and those that follow, Matthew wants his readers then and us to know that Jesus was actively bracing his disciples for persecution that would eventually come. He builds on this idea in the next statement. He says, "Whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it." Now, what's this about? Multiple lives? Last time I checked, we only get one. It's not like the video games of my youth where you could find a green mushroom and get another shot at rescuing a princess from an evil dinosaur. I was going for the 80s people with that. Does this mean that Christians shouldn't value human life? Absolutely not. I value my life. It's woven into the decisions that I make on a daily basis. I buckle my seatbelt before I move off in the car. I don't gravitate toward dangerous hobbies like deep sea diving or ski jumping. And I definitely don't make jokes when I'm talking to the American Department of Homeland Security officers, right? Now, here in Scotland, I don't think any of us will be thinking actively about being killed on the basis of our faith. But this is definitely true for many of our brothers and sisters around the world. I think what Jesus is doing here is taking that which we would value, treasure, and protect most fiercely, our own lives, and saying that we need to value Him above them. This is understandably a really tall order, but it's also something that only the Son of God could actually ask of us. Hauerwas again says, Jesus is not telling His disciples that if they learn to live unselfishly, they will live more satisfying lives. Rather, He says that any sacrifices they make must be done for His sake. The crosses they bear must be ones determined by His cross. What Jesus asks of His disciples makes no sense if Jesus is not who He says He is. You do not ask those who follow you to a cross unless you are the Son of God. You do not ask your brothers and sisters to contemplate the death of those they love if you are not the Messiah. You do not make Peter the rock on whom the church is built if you are not the one who has inaugurated the new age. But Jesus is all this and more, requiring His disciples to live lives not determined by death. If this is the benchmark for what life as a disciple of Jesus looked like for His disciples, what should this say to me here today? To be very honest, it's really convicting. It means that how I spend my time, how I spend my money, how I support my family and my friends, how I am intentional about sharing the hope that I've found in Jesus. If take up your cross and follow me as the benchmark, I suspect that all of us could take a moment to reconsider different ways in which we might step up to Jesus' call. Now there's one last illustration. And it's picking up on the sort of financial element I mentioned just now. Jesus says, what good is it for someone to gain the whole world and yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? Now remember Jesus' audience. He's not exactly speaking to the House of Lords or the Royal Society of Edinburgh. These are fishermen, laborers, tradesmen, tax collectors, not exactly people who were in a position to gain the whole world. But maybe that's it. I think it may refer back to when Jesus was tempted back in chapter 4. Satan is dangling the prospect of being in charge over all the territories he could see in front of him in order to try to get him to abandon his mission. I suspect Jesus is essentially saying that all the stuff people usually try to accomplish in life, live longer, make more money, gain more influence, live in that postcode, send your kids to that school, those things aren't actually as important ultimately as following Him. And that's not to say that there's anything inherently wrong, incidentally, with being health conscious or independently wealthy or in a position of power in society. But the point is, we need to consider what we are pursuing most in our lives, Jesus or things. And let's look how the passage ends. Jesus says that He is going to come in the Father's glory with His angels, and then He will reward each person according to what they have done. What does that mean? For starters, I think it means that true justice will prevail. All those times it seems like the perpetrators of horrible offenses will get off completely free, that, well, no, they're going to face judgment. Nobody can hide from Jesus' just and perfect judgment. The eagle-eyed among you might have also noticed this little verse at the end of the passage, that some who were standing with Jesus would not taste death before he returned. Now, that's one of those verses that people like to use as a bit of a brain teaser. I found a little passage by an ancient figure in the church, Cyril of Alexandria, who points out that in the very next passage, which Matt is going to talk on in a couple weeks, we see this moment called the Transfiguration, which Cyril calls a prelude to Jesus' return. So what's most likely here is that Jesus isn't actually referring to his final return, but this is a moment where some of his disciples would get the privilege to just see a glimpse of how incredible Jesus' return in glory would be. Now, what do we make of all this? I'm first going to speak to people in the room who are followers of Jesus. And I want to ask you, are you perhaps tempted to see your faith and your life in temporal ways, like Peter did? Are you waiting for God to move political chess pieces so that your preferred political party comes into power? Are you expecting change and transformation in the world to come from the top down? The revolution Jesus proclaimed was not fulfilled in the corridors of power. It came about in the transformation of individual hearts. And I don't think it's any different for us today. And seeing hearts transformed is exactly what we're about at Hope City. It's why it says share your hope as you walk out of the building. It's why we're here today without some of our friends, some of our family members, because we want to see men and women and boys and girls beginning and growing in their journeys in following Jesus. And if you're not a follower of Jesus today, I wonder what you make of all this. Jesus is essentially saying that this world, this existence, it's not everything. He's saying that something greater awaits us. Human sin and selfishness has done a number on our world, physically and emotionally, politically and ecologically. The great writer C.S. Lewis, in his book Mere Christianity, has a really important and thought-provoking line. Maybe you've heard it. He says, "If I find in myself desires which nothing in this world can satisfy, the only logical explanation is that I was made for another world." I think this is exactly what Jesus was getting at in this passage. If this world is all there is, and this mode of existence is the only one we get, then it is crazy to follow his teaching, right? But what if it is true? And this world isn't all there is. And there is something far greater that lies ahead. If you want to explore this more, there's plenty of options. Feel free to come chat to one of the leaders after the gathering. Drop me an email. Come along to one of our classes. Whatever you do, dig deep into these questions. They could change your life forever. Let's pray. Gracious God, thank you for your Son. Thank you for the hope we have in him. Please work in and through each of us as only you can do. In his name, amen.
Thanks so much, Tom. The power of the resurrection will change your life, and it'll give you strength you never knew. We're going to sing a song about the coming of Jesus, and hopefully that reminds us that whatever suffering you're going through, it is temporary. It is indeed temporary. Let's stand and sing. There is a day that all creation's waiting for, a day of freedom and liberation for the earth. And on that day, the Lord will come to meet his bride. When we see him, in an instant we'll be changed. The trumpet sounds and the dead will then be raised. By his power, never to perish again. Once only flesh, now clothed with immortality. Death has now been swallowed up in victory. We will meet him in the air, and then we will be like him, for we will see him as he is. Oh yeah. Then all hurt and pain will cease, and we'll be with him forever, and in his glory we will live. Oh, yeah. So lift your eyes to the things as yet unseen, that will remain now for all eternity. Though trouble's hard, it's only momentary, and it's achieving our future glory. We will meet him in the air, and then we will be like him, for we will see him as he is. Oh yeah. Then all hurt and pain will cease, and we'll be with him forever, and in his glory we will live. Oh yeah. One more time. We will meet him in the air, and we will be like him, for we will see him as he is. Oh yeah. Then all hurt and pain will cease, and we'll be with him forever. In his glory we will live. Oh yeah. Please be seated.
Well, as we said before, we want to take the opportunity to try and share with one another, to think about what all this means for us. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to talk about, with someone sitting next to you, what we've been hearing about this morning. What are your reflections? What are your thoughts? And also, maybe you can have a little look. I think we're just getting up on screen some of the questions. Vote any questions up you like, and we'll try and answer a couple of the top questions in a couple of minutes after you've chatted together. So have a minute or two to talk together, and then I'll bring us back in a minute, and Tom will answer all the difficult questions. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I hope you've had a chance to start to think through, as we've been talking about. We don't want to just come and have these words sort of roll over us as we move into the week ahead. We believe this is God speaking to us through his word. So it's great to take that opportunity and think about what does it actually mean for us. So we're going to take the chance to think about a couple of the top questions. And Tom, why is suffering and death still essential for us after Jesus paid the penalty when he suffered and died?
Right. I should preface at the beginning by saying I don't have all the answers. I have what makes sense to me, and I might kick things over to you and if I get desperate. But I think that the idea here is to say that actually suffering and death aren't essential, but Jesus is saying they're to be expected. Why should they be expected? Well, we are still engaged in the same battle that Jesus was fighting. I think you can look at the cross. I had an old teacher describe it that the cross is a little bit like D-Day. It was the battle that won the Second World War, but it didn't mean the war was over. There was still fighting to be had. In D-Day, the back of the enemy was broken, but there was still very much an enemy that needed to be fought. And so we will still encounter opposition. We will still encounter resistance. We will still encounter violent opposition because we're still in this battle. The decisive victory has been had, but we're still waiting for Jesus to come back like we just sang about. So that would be my perspective. Does that make sense?
Thank you, Tom. I think we're going to try, it's not the next question, but it's related. Do we just have to accept suffering then because it's part of God's picture?
That's such a huge question. I think I would want to understand a bit more about an individual situation and circumstance. I don't want to throw out a blanket answer to this because it does depend on what's being talked about here. Suffice to say, whatever you are suffering with, as I alluded to in this talk, you are worshiping a God who knows what it is to suffer and who sits alongside you in it, and in whom you can find comfort and hope. And hopefully, in the company of God's people, you can find comfort and hope. And the staff team here are all very keen to look to support you in whatever ways we can. So if that's something on your mind and you've not reached out, please do send me an email. Reach out to Rachel. Thanks you.
Thank you. Thank you. And then maybe just one more question, the other most voted for question. Verse 27 says, Jesus will reward every person according to what they have done. How does that relate to Jesus offering to save us, independent of our works, which I take as of what we do?
Yeah, that's right. So we aren't kind of building up a little treasure chest of good deeds so that we can be put right with God. The reality is we stand in need of complete and total rescue. The idea here is that in the end, there is one resurrection, there is one judgment, and everybody will see Jesus exactly who he is. Now, for his followers, that's a moment of beautiful reconciliation and recognition. But if you're not following Jesus, you can imagine that that's not. So the idea is, in this trial, if you will, at the end of history, the wrongdoing, the sins that the followers of Christ have done, has already been taken. The punishment for that has been taken on Jesus. So Jesus is, the idea here is it's a transfer, that Jesus covers us with his righteousness, his goodness, his obedience to the Father, and we pass on him our sin. But if you're not following Jesus, that hasn't happened, and that won't happen. So I think that's the idea here. It's not about our works, but it is about complete and total fairness, complete and total perfect justice. No one will escape justice in the end. I think that's what, is that what you are thinking?
Yeah, yes, I think so. I suppose there's also that idea in the Bible that somehow we are saved or not saved entirely on what Jesus has done, but there is a reflection on how we have lived, that there is some thanks from God for living in the way he would have wanted us to live while we're here, is also true. But the main thing is that entirely we belong with him, we are saved, we are part of his people because of what he did and not because of us. Yeah. Tom, do you want to remind us of your main point for the day as we move towards closing?
Yeah, it's essentially this. Following Jesus is going to be hard, but he paved the way for us.
Thank you.